Chapter 3 of your textbook is on bodies, and it begins with kind of the interesting example of the anglerfish. So the female anglerfish is much bigger than the male and has the ability to attract prey. The male anglerfish is very small and has no lure, so can't attract food on its own. And even if it could, it has no stomach, so it wouldn't be able to digest it. So the only way that the male anglerfish survives is by attaching itself to a female anglerfish and basically receiving nutrients through that attachment. But eventually the male anglerfish just kind of dissolves into the female anglerfish. The only thing it leaves behind is a pair of testicles. And so a female anglerfish can have multiple pairs of testicles attached to her, which just kind of is indicative of the male partners the female anglerfish has had in her past. So yay, fun. We begin with weird animal facts. And that's because the authors are really just trying to make the point that we are not anglerfish. Human bodies do not have that level of high sexual dimorphism. And sexual dimorphism is a term that we've discussed in previous videos. And so just a reminder, although the anglerfish is an extreme example, there are other animals when we look to the animal kingdom, whether you're talking about lions or ducks or peacocks or orangutans or elephant seals, right? There are these other animals that look dramatically different in terms of the male and the female of the species. And that's just not true of the human body. Obviously we are different. We do have some differences. We have our, primary sexual characteristics, which are our genitalia. And then we have our secondary sexual characteristics that normally come in at puberty. And in general, for women, that would be like things like breast, and for men, they're hairier. But I mean, these are minute differences when you're thinking about other animals in the animal kingdom. And that's why we say that humans have low sexual dimorphism. Even though we talk about ourselves as if, we're opposite sexes. That was the point of the last chapter, right? When we discussed the gender binary. That, there is this ideology that we're not just really different, but like we're really dramatic, polar opposite different. And, the conclusion of that chapter is that's just not true. That was the whole point of chapter 2, was breaking down the fact that, women are not from Venus and men are not from Mars. We're both from Earth. And the fact of the matter is we aren't even from different countries. We are like from the same town, maybe just one road over. We aren't that different. But, and this is the question that kind of guides chapter 3 on bodies, the question here for this chapter is, they're asking, are there real differences between men and women? And so, before the authors get into answering that question, they point out that, this is difficult to answer. And they talk about, why it's difficult to answer. First reason being differences can vary over time and across cultures. Human beings, being the socio-cultural animals that they are, we adapt and we change. And, what it means to be a man in 2020 America is different than what it means to be a man in 2020 Japan or 2020 Nigeria or 2020 Brazil. Likewise, what it means to be a woman in 2020 America is different than a woman in 1970 America, which is different than a woman in 1920 America, which is different than women in 1820 America. So, when we're talking about real differences, like, we have to account for that variability. Second point as to why it's difficult, differences can respond to psychological manipulation and practice and training. If you think of something as being a real difference, then it should be stable and it should be consistent. So what does it say if some of these differences that we think of as being real and stable actually are so susceptible to this manipulation. And we'll talk more about that in this video. Number 3, differences are sensitive to how we design studies and define measurements, right? So, you know, if we measure strength by, you know, number of push-ups on the toes or number of pull-ups, then that gap between men and women might be very different than if we measure, you know, strength in a different way, like, you know, squatting a percentage of the body weight, just because of how men's and women's muscle mass tend to be differently allotted. So, you know, or in terms of something like sociability, right? You know, if we measure it in terms of smiling, you know, then women might look like they're much more sociable. But if we measure it in terms of something else, then once again, that difference might go away. And then finally, we would have to amass a lot of evidence, and then we would have to consider all the possible influences. And so it would just really be a massive undertaking. Which isn't to say there haven't been studies, systematic reviews that have attempted to do just that. So the systematic review that your book focuses on is the Zale and fellow researchers. They studied the differences between men and women by basically amassing a huge data set that was comprised of 20,000 different studies, 12 million people, over 12,000 measures of 386 traits. So it was one of the largest studies of its time. And what they found was that for 39% of those 386 traits, there was basically no statistical difference, right? So there was no discernible difference between males and females. For 46% of the traits, there was only a small statistical difference. And so an example of some of those traits would be like talkativeness, leadership style, assertiveness of speech. And once again, these small differences, especially when considering the fact how things can be very susceptible to measurement, you know, they were like, okay, can't make a big deal out of these small statistical differences across these traits because this might just be a matter of measurement. Then we get into the larger differences where we really can start like with a little bit more confidence, basically saying, okay, maybe there really is a real difference here. So when it comes to medium-sized differences, this was 12% of traits. And some of them, and these are the ones because, you know, they are a larger difference. They're going to come up again in the chapter as we kind of talk about, are they real or are they not? But things like physical aggression, visual spatial, visual spatial kind of understanding and knowledge and skills, physical. And so like this one that often comes up a lot is the throw like a girl. And I always like to show both of these clips in class. So I'm encouraging you to watch them on your own. One of them is the Always commercial, like a girl. And one of the things they ask, people, women, men, boys, and girls to do is mimic doing different things like a girl. And I don't want to ruin it for those of you who've never seen it, but I encourage you to just watch it and think about the implications. And then there was this very interesting segment on Mythbusters. I don't know if I have any Mythbusters fans, but it was about throwing like a girl. And once again, just kind of, watch that and consider the conclusions that they come to. So those things were medium differences. When it comes to large differences, that was 2% of traits, and most of them were related to sexuality. Particular things like how often, do you think about sex? How often do you masturbate? And in the same way that I'm going to later pick apart the social aspects or the social underpinnings of throwing like a girl, I would just want you to kind of consider how in a society, that traditionally for like the last, couple of centuries in most places in Western culture, there is this stigma around female sexuality that doesn't exist around male sexuality, where men are given permission to be studs and women are labeled sluts, and how this might, especially since for they did note, for this particular measure, it was just self-reports, right, about how often people thought about sex, how often they masturbated. Just consider how that would then lead to these large differences. And we'll come back to an interesting point that the authors make about that difference here in a second. And the final one, which is 1% of traits, extra large differences. This is pretty straightforward, and it probably really just has a lot to do with how we label gender and sex, and also in our society, in most societies, how there is this compulsory heterosexuality. But it's basically saying that there was a sex difference in gender identity, meaning most male-bodied people identified as men, and most female bodied people identified as women. And then similar with sexual orientation, most male bodied people indicated that they were attracted to women, and most female bodied people indicated that they were attracted to men. So make of that one, these two extra large differences, what you will. So this is just a table for those of you that maybe like to read charts and get a sense of what this looks like in coefficients. This isn't the Zell study. This is a study that preceded it by a couple of years. Very similar in scope, slightly smaller in size, very similar in findings. And it was by a researcher named Hyde. But I just kind of wanted to give you a sense of, when we're talking small, medium, large differences, what does that look like in terms of coefficient size? And this is from the Zell study, and it's just kind of showing some of the other research studies that they were referencing and they were pulling from. And it kind of lets you see, for the things that they found a difference in, what the result was. Was it, males were more likely to do this, females were more likely to score high on this. So there are these observable differences, right? And so this starts with, this gets into the meat of the chapter, where they start picking apart this concept of real. And they give you like 4 definitions of, what does it mean when we say something is real? So definition number 1, sex differences are real if we can measure them. So are these observable differences? Can we observe these differences? And so it's worth noting that, especially if you focus on the characteristics that Zell indicated have medium to large differences, we would call those clear observed differences, meaning that for most males and for most females, you're going to see an observed difference in their responses. But are they real? So now they start kind of picking apart, are they really real? So one observed difference that was of medium size was smiling and helping behavior. And it was women were more likely to smile and be helpful. However, what they learned is that, when you aren't talking about self-reports, or when people don't think that someone is watching, that a lot of this sex difference goes away, which suggests, of course, that a lot of women are out there smiling because as women, they are expected to smile. And if you've ever had a stranger, usually male, say something like, smile, beautiful, or, you look better with a smile, then you might know why women go around smiling when they feel like they're being observed, even if they don't feel like smiling. Likewise, they said if there was an incentive to being really honest, basically that some of these differences would go away. Specifically, this one was in reference to that sexual behavior, right? We talk about women being stigmatized for being sexual, but men have a lot of pressure on them in society to indicate that they are sexual, even when maybe they're not. And so what they found is like, when it came to something like reports about thinking about sex and masturbation, when they made people think that they were going to be when they were going to be like, you know, hooked up to a lie detector test, then those differences between the sexes, the size of that difference shrunk. Similarly, they could get the size of the difference to shrink if, you know, they emphasized to people that their answers were anonymous, not just confidential, but anonymous, that the difference then shrunk. Then your book talks about like how priming and or stereotype threat works. So you can prime someone for exhibiting a behavior or saying that they up you know, hold a stereotype by reminding them that that stereotype exists. So, you know, something like empathy they talked about, if women were asked to identify themselves as being women right before a test of empathy, then oftentimes they would be more empathetic. And that's because in their brains, they've been primed to think about themselves as being women. And in most societies, women are expected to be empathetic. So it's kind of like someone's reminding you of a characteristic that is expected of you in society, and then it makes you more likely to say, oh yes, I am that. And you know, empathy is kind of a good characteristic, but you know, what about if it's something negative? And so in that sense, you know, stereotype is a specific form of priming, a negative form of priming. And this is where if people are reminded about the stereotypes that exist around their group level characteristic, that sometimes that they'll underperform. And stereotype threat has been tested quite a bit when it comes to testing. Both racial minorities and females have been found to be susceptible to stereotype threat, right? So, you know, if you remind people like, oh yeah, women aren't good at math, right? That stereotype, then their math scores, and then you give them a test, then their math scores go down, versus a control who isn't primed to think about, you know, the stereotypes related to women and math ability. You know, their test scores don't exhibit that same level of dip. And so, you know, based on the fact that these observed differences can be manipulated, you know, your book wants you to think about these differences in terms of, yes, they're observable, but they're not real in the naturally occurring sense, that a lot of them are perhaps learned differences. We learn as women that we're supposed to smile more. We learn from larger society as men that we are not just allowed, but expected to be sexual, to be thinking about sex all the time. And so then when people ask us about these things, and particularly as adults, you know, we've learned what is expected of us. So, you know, it might feel like, oh yes, well, I smile all the time because I'm just, you know, a smiler. But you know, that isn't necessarily a biological difference, right? It's a learned difference. And so that's the quote that comes from your book on page 45. The differences Zell and his colleagues observed then are real in that we really observe them, but they don't necessarily stand up when we poke and prod them. And so that goes back to that whole difficulty of measuring difference, right? The fact that, you know, if differences can be manipulated, easily manipulated, does that mean that they're real? And so then this brings up our definition 2 of defining real. Sex differences are real if they are observed in all or most contemporary cultures. All right, so here's the thing. If there are gender differences that are observed around the world and throughout history, we would have compelling reason to believe it is real, because that means that men and women, regardless of where they're raised or what time period they are living in, if they're exhibiting this difference in behavior, that, you know, it probably isn't, it's probably less likely to be a learned difference, because those societies would be so different, right? That couldn't be the answer. And so when we turn to definition 2, it's like, okay, you know, how do we answer that? Well, one problem that we have when it comes to answering that, like, are there differences that exist throughout history and across different cultures? One issue that we have here, as your book points out, is because there's a gap in the research. Most of our studies, particularly most of our studies pre-1990s, they focused on what your book called weird. And by weird, I don't mean like odd or strange. I mean weird as in the acronym. And the acronym weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, right? So a lot of our studies have been in those countries, although it's worth noting that, only about 12% of the world's population fits that definition, right? So we almost can't even address this definition because there is a huge gap in the research. But to the extent that we have looked at multiple, countries and differences, what is the finding? Well, in this section, your book talks about the math ability. So, there is, and I referenced it, just a couple of minutes ago, there is this stereotype, and it's not a stereotype, it is supported in the United States, that men are better at math than women. And we see these disparities in skill emerging in middle school, high school. Boys score higher than girls do on the quantitative section of the SAT, and like math integrates test. And so, and so this belief, right, women are just less likely to be good in math. I mean, this belief is so commonplace that, as your book pointed out, in 1992, when Barbie put out a Teen Talk Barbie, one of the phrases that she said was math class is tough. And so, that isn't just random, right? It really reflected this idea, oh yes, for a lot of teen girls, math is tough. They don't like math. So is this true across other countries? What does the data suggest? So when we are looking at math ability, what does the data suggest? Well, first of all, if we look at it cross-nationally, meaning we look at it with other countries, you can see that while men do have higher scores in math than women in a lot of countries, that is not universally true. There are some countries where women on average score much higher than men. The Czech Republic kind of stands out there. And where else are we looking? I felt like there was another country that I wanted to point out. And then, so not just like the Czech Republic, but even among like some of the European countries, Iceland, the United Kingdom, they mentioned Thailand. And so then if you compare, between countries, then it becomes even more complicated, or, less gendered, in the sense that, okay, in Japan, men outscore women, but Japanese girls outscore American boys. So it becomes not a clear sex difference. Historically, it also isn't a very stable difference, because when we look at test results over time, in the last 20 years, especially as we've started to push STEM and push young women to consider STEM careers, we've seen the gap between male and female test scores dramatically narrow in the United States. No, not disappear, but dramatically narrow. And then finally, your book says, the other kind of thing to consider is, what are we using as a measurement. So I've been talking a lot about standardized tests, but if you turn to grades, oftentimes, regardless of standardized test data, girls get higher grades in high school and college in their math classes. So this goes back to that other issue, right, with measuring difference, because how we measure is also very important. And so what they find is that the best predictor of math ability is actually beliefs around math ability and sex. That the gap between male and female, math ability is smallest in the countries where culturally they don't have the message that women are bad at math, versus cultures that do have that belief, that do support that belief. That's where the gap seems to be the highest. And so in that way, this sex difference, this just shows you, that even something that looks pretty consistent in our own country right now at a given time period becomes a little bit more complicated when you consider other time periods and other cultures. And so that's the point that they end that section with. When observed sex differences show variation over time and across cultures, it suggests that they are not inevitable and universal. When we see less variation, assuming they are real is more plausible. When sex differences resist cultural influence, it might be a hint that they are not just related to gendered stereotypes and opportunities, but may be part of being biologically human. So that brings us to section 3, right? That sex differences are real if they're biological, right? So now we're going to be turning to the body, right? Because we find that a lot of the cultural differences, they vary across cultures, they vary across time periods, so they're not stable, they're not consistent, so they don't meet that benchmark or they don't meet the author's benchmark for realness. But what about if we turn to biology? So when we're talking about biological differences, and here they're looking specifically at biological differences as it relates to hormones, genetics, and brain morphology. So beginning first with genes. So they talk about that, a gene, these are the, set of instructions for building and maintaining our bodies, right? So we all have our own unique genetic code, and it's unique to us, and that's our genotype. And how that genotype is expressed, what's observable, what's visible, we call that our phenotype. So genotype, your actual genes, phenotype, how they are then expressed in terms of your looks as well as your behaviors. And so your book notes that there are differences in the genetic contribution of the X and Y chromosomes. So one interesting fun fact that comes out of this chapter is that most of our kind of genetic material is carried on X chromosomes. And really, they say that, now that we've broken, we have cracked the genetic code, we know that in terms of the material that's carried on the Y, that it's actually not a lot. It gives boy fetuses functioning testes and adult males. It helps facilitate male fertility, but beyond kind of that basic sex difference, the only other characteristics that's carried on the Y chromosome is apparently hairy ears, which is why I guess, men have hairy ears, and for the most part, you don't see, although women have, hair plenty of other places, you don't see a lot of hairy eared women because, no Y chromosome. So what else is going on there in terms of those genetic differences? So they talk about, 3 ways that genetics can contribute to gender difference. They talk about the fact that some traits are what they call sex-linked, some traits are what they call sex-limited, and some traits are what they call sex-influenced. All right, so I'm going to work my way up. So let's talk about sex influenced first. So sex influenced is the type of genetic difference where it only occurs in the presence of some other characteristic. So for instance, baldness, for instance, although the baldness gene can be carried by men and women, it usually is influenced by having a high level of testosterone. And most women do not have a high enough level of testosterone to trigger that gene from expressing itself. So the baldness gene, while it might be carried in a woman, is less likely to be expressed, and so that's what we mean by sex influenced. And so they say, interestingly enough, similarly, high versus low voices, gene that once again is influenced by the presence of certain sexual hormones, right? So, in women, it makes their voices high, and in men, it gives them, lower voices. So that's sex influenced. Then we have sex limited. So these are genes that literally only get expressed in a male or female body. And the example your book gives you is basically milk production, which allows women to breastfeed. So that gene, which both men and women have, it only it only is active if it is then in a female body. So that's what's meant by sex limited. And sometimes students are like, well, how is that different than sex influenced? Because sex influenced, there are women who experience baldness, and usually those are women that have higher level amounts of testosterone, right? So just, kind of recall that when we were talking about, what makes someone a male versus a female bodied person, that there are kind of anomalies that happen, that there isn't always this perfect correlation between, you have sex hormones and you have the corresponding genitalia and you have the corresponding chromosomes, that sometimes there can be these different pathways and these anomalies, mutations that kind of branch off. And so in this case, like something like baldness, if a woman happens to have a higher level of testosterone, then it doesn't matter that she is a female body, the baldness will occur. While something like sex limited really is limited to someone having really all of those corresponding sexual traits, characteristics, hormones, and chromosomes. And now maybe kind of the most involved one is sex linked. And so your book goes very deeply into detail about the fact that, because women have two X's and men have just one X, and as we've already said, most of our genetic material is carried on an X, that means that if something is recessive, like color blindness, men are going to be more likely to experience it because all they need is that one, that one X. So, they could get, if their mother is recessive, and this is kind of what that image is trying to depict there. If you have a carrier mother, that, whether or not she gives a a non-affected X or an affected X to her son kind of is going to determine whether or not he gets that recessive trait. While her daughter literally is going to not have it because the daughter, if the father is unaffected, is going to get an X from her father that doesn't carry the trait, and so it doesn't matter which X she gets from her mother, and so this is why we see color blindness in much greater proportions among men than among women. So for people that love genetics and biology, you probably know a lot more about this than me. I admit I find it interesting, but I'm fairly limited in my knowledge about it. Beyond the basics, what you read here in the book. So if anyone has some better examples or interesting information, you would like to share it, feel free to shoot that to me. Otherwise, going back to our other biological sources of biological difference. So one other source is hormones. Once again, we talked about this in a previous chapter, that all human hormones circulate in both men's and women's bodies, but they do so in different proportions, right? Men tend to have more testosterone, women tend to have more estrogen. And so particularly testosterone has been a focus of research. So what is it about testosterone? It's been shown to be related to things like sex drive, aggression, visual spatial ability. And we know that for young men, it's responsible for sex differentiation at two of the most kind of critical points in their lives. It distinguishes the XY fetus into a male fetus between weeks 7 and 12 during fetal development. This is called the testosterone bath. So there's like a wave of testosterone that the male-bodied fetus receives, and this is what allows or begins, the genitalia differentiation, right? Is why, at some point towards the end of that first trimester, the doctor can tell if you're having a male or female infant because that testosterone bath has taken place. And then there is an influx of testosterone in male bodies during puberty, right? And this is why we start to see some of the development of those secondary sex characteristics. Taller, broader shoulders, more hair, deeper voice, all of that's kind of related to that second wave of testosterone. But throughout men's lives and females' lives, but particularly men's lives, testosterone, their level of free testosterone in their body can change, can vary. And so, the level of testosterone that a man has in his body at any given moment, it isn't stable. Your book makes that point that we often talk about hormonal fluctuations that exist in women, but hormonal fluctuations also exist in men. And although and just in general, the level of testosterone that men have varies within the population, just like with women, right? So on average, men have more testosterone than women. They have more because they have more free testosterone in their system. But certainly there are some women that have higher testosterone, and they can overlap with men that are have particularly low testosterone. So this is why you don't want to think about it as an all or nothing, males have this, females have this type of situation. And so it leads to, in what situations, does testosterone influence behavior, right? That's kind of been a big question. And certainly research seems to suggest that there is what we call a bidirectional relationship between testosterone and aggression, meaning that, you do something aggressive, like get in a fight. If you win that fight, it actually causes you to have more testosterone, which perhaps contribute to you being more likely to get into another fight. And so it becomes kind of a cycle. You can maybe certainly see this with people that participate in violent sports. Some of the difficulties that they might have turning that behavior off once they leave the field or the rink. I'm thinking about like football and hockey in particular. That type of violence that can happen within the sport oftentimes spills over into their day-to-day lives, their relationships, their interactions with other people. And it is at least maybe partially because of this bidirectional relationship between testosterone and aggression. But then there's also this placebo effect of testosterone, right? Because once again, these cultural stereotypes matter. So what we tell ourselves and what we tell people about testosterone also gets in people's heads. So, it's been shown that, just telling someone like, oh yes, I'm giving you, testosterone, take this testosterone pill, or like, oh yes, you have high testosterone, even if they really don't, even if it's just a sugar pill, it then makes them more likely to engage in this aggressive behavior because of what people think they know about testosterone. And so once again, it brings up that whole very tricky, if we can manipulate it so easily, is it in fact a real difference? And so, as I kind of said, before I leave the topic of testosterone alone, we do know it varies across men's lives. It varies between men of status. Men of higher social status tend to have higher levels of testosterone. Married men with families tend to have lower levels of testosterone. Girls who have androgenital syndrome have higher testosterone. Girls whose mothers took progestins during pregnancy have higher testosterone, while boys who took estrogen during pregnancy tend to have lower. So all of this is just shows that, once again, that this isn't kind of this perfect correlate that we think it is. And of course, as I indicated, some of the issues that we have with this research is how it can in fact be manipulated. And once again, how the fact that there is still this cultural element that, in our society where we say, oh yes, it's boys being boys, or, oh, men are aggressive because of their testosterone, is still just worth noting that if we look at other cultures, right, if we look at that cultural variation, although aggression, men are more likely to be aggressive than women in most societies, the size of that difference does vary. And it varies in such a way that it can't be because it can't be explained by testosterone, right? Men in all societies have this variable amount of testosterone that is, in most cases, higher than the women in societies. But in some societies, like the United States, men's reported levels of aggression, their participation in violent crimes is much higher than men in other societies. So, once again, it just suggests that biology isn't the only kind of underpinning, it isn't the only explanation of what's going on. The final kind of potential biological source of difference is brains. So a big question of brain organization theory is how are how are male and female brains different? And they are different. There, and your book does note there are these differences in size, in shape, in composition, and even in function, like rate of blood flow, how quickly the brain metabolizes glucose, neurotransmitter levels. And I'm just taking the book's word for it because, once again, let me remind you all, not a STEM major, but there are these differences. but there are kind of two things that kind of complicate, the importance of this. One issue is, there's been a lack of research that has conclusively shown that these differences actually matter, in terms of behaviors and personalities, right? We haven't gotten the data to line up in that type of way. And it's made more complicated by the fact that most of us have what's called gender non-conforming brains. And so the author says this is actually like almost 98% of us. So, what does that mean? It means that if you're looking at all those possible ways in which male brains differ from female brains, most of us have brains that are some amalgamation of male and female in terms of its characteristics, right? Size, composition, functionality. So although it might make for a cute movie, in 2018, the movie The Female Brain came out, it scientifically is just not that clear cut. And then it becomes even less clear cut when we start looking at the relationship between hormones and brains and gender difference. Because, that is my dog. So my apologies, that was my dog. So he got kicked out of the room here. I think I was at the point where I was talking about the relationship between hormones, brains, and gender difference. So, your book just kind of talks about how this has been just really complicated. And, once again, the one hypothesis that your book goes over is that our brains, our bodies perhaps evolved in order to enable sexual difference for purposes of reproduction, but also to compensate for any maladaptive differences that arise as a consequence of building male and female bodied people. And all of this, I think, is a complicated way of just saying we really are set up to be as similar as possible. And so, once again, we are just creatures that have very low sexual dimorphism. So one example that your book explicitly kind of, talks about in terms of, difference in brain functioning has to do with mental rotation. And so, the mental rotation test, can you look at figures that have been rotated and determine are they the same figure or not? And what they found is that when it comes to mental rotation, that there is a sex difference, that this is a medium size, and this was supported by Zale's study, but this is a medium size sex difference. And oftentimes, females were worse at this than males. But this is another example of something that, as it turns out, can be manipulated. It isn't stable. It is, in fact, mutable. So what they discovered is that they could diminish the size of that gap between males and females by basically requiring women to play Tetris. And they said, this study basically showed that if you assign women to a semester of playing Tetris, it pretty much closed the pre-existing gap between men's and women's scores. And that just even 10 hours of play reduced the difference to the point where it was no longer statistically significant. And so all of this just suggests, of course, that, biology isn't destiny, that, even if there are these perhaps built-in differences, sex differences in the brain, and we aren't sure to what extent, they are, to what extent they exist, but even the ones that we are aware of, like mental rotation, that conclusion, your brain is what you do with it, is an important one. And so that brings us to the final definition that kind of just combines all of the previous definitions. Sex differences are real if they are biological and immutable, meaning that they aren't cultural, they aren't learned differences, because learned differences that are based in culture are going to vary across time and space. And So they need to be rooted in biology, but then they need to be immutable. And so the quote from page 54, perhaps the sex difference could count as real if it were observed, had a known biological cause, and could not easily be overcome by social interventions like training and priming. So under this definition, how many traits would be considered real? Certainly not many of them. Your book talks about, to some extent, would like gender identity and sexual orientation, particularly maybe sexual orientation, maybe there still would be a certain high difference between, females being attracted to males and males being attracted to females, although probably not the same size difference as it is in a society where heterosexuality is compulsory, more or less, or feels compulsory, or has been compulsory in previous decades. But the conclusion is it probably just isn't a lot of traits. This chapter was really just a long way of justifying the point that it started off with, that we are, as humans, we are a species that has low sexual dimorphism. And to go back to my original throwing like a girl example, although there are these physical differences in strength, once again, especially, and some of that does seem to be biological, like body mechanics, it also has a lot to do with culture, which hopefully you figured out if you watch the Always commercial, right? The messages that we get about women being ladylike and women being strong and not needing to do push-ups on our toes, and whether or not we grew up in families where we were encouraged to throw balls around or not throw balls around. The fact that there is that variation means that this isn't necessarily an immutable characteristic. And even if it were immutable, although it's not, and this is from another study that just kind of once again compares males and females, but and it shows the overlap between the two. I always like to use this chart, and I give you a link to the study, because yes, although at the tail ends of strength, there are men that are much stronger, and there are women who are much weaker in terms of physical strength. And in particular, in this study, it was measured by long jump, high jump, and javelin throw. There are those overlaps, right? There are clearly in this society plenty of men who are not athletic, and there are women who are athletic who are overlapping with those non-athletic men. So there is this gap between the most athletic women, at least as measured by long jump, high jump, javelin throw, and the most athletic men. But once again, there isn't this perfect distinction between the sexes. And then if you move away from something like physical strength, which you might argue in our society is becoming more and more obsolete, to personality characteristics like assertiveness, you can see that there are now these huge overlaps, right? That although there are a little bit more men that indicate that they're assertive and a little bit more women that indicate that they are not assertive, that there are instead that compared to the physical strength chart, that there are huge overlaps when we start talking about behavior. So the last part of this chapter really addressed, to the extent that there are differences, where do they come from? So this is getting at the heart of, the observable differences, which may or may not be real. Where do they even come from? And this nature versus nurture argument. And so when it comes to nature versus nurture, nature, also called naturalism, also called biological determinism, versus nurture, also called culturalism, also called differential socialization. So basically, are we born with these differences, or, are we taught them? Do we learn them through socialization, our families, our schools, and larger society? So which of these ideologies do the authors support? Trick question. They reject both of them, and instead, and they reject both of them because they're like, both of them are an incomplete explanation. Instead, the argument that they put forth is that it's about biocultural intersection. So first of all, let's talk about why we have to talk about culture. It is society that makes us human. And we know society makes us like, yeah, you're born a human baby, right? You know, you're not born a puppy. You're not born a lion cub. You're not born a tadpole. But when you think about human behavior, human characteristics, that isn't innate in humans the way it is in other animals. We do have to be taught. And we know we have to be taught because we can look at examples of what happens when that doesn't occur. We have examples of that historically through feral children, children that have been found in the wild who literally just more or less reverted back to kind of like animalistic behavior. Isolated children. A very good example of that is the story of Jeannie. Jeannie was basically kept locked in a dark bedroom with no human interaction up until the age of 12 years old when she was discovered. And you know, at age 12, when researchers kind of took over her care, what they discovered is there is a time limit. If we miss the window of socialization, you know, we miss the window of making you human. You know, they were able to teach Jeannie, you know, some basic words, but her verbal, her language, as well as quantitative skills, were always very stunted. And perhaps more important, morally, you know, it was some just moral retardation there. And what I mean by that is, you know, as 2, 3, 4-year olds, when we learn to respect other people's property and keep hands, feet, and objects to ourselves, and we learn to be honest and it's wrong to lie, when we learn how to be a good friend, when we learn how to control our impulses so we don't, you know, violently lash out at people. You know, we had to learn that because all of that goes against animal nature. Getting Jeannie at age 12, what researchers found is that those were very hard things for her to teach. I mean, for her to learn at that age. And isolated children, you know, still exist. We've also learned that, you know, even if they're not completely isolated, institutionalized children who don't receive enough care or love, particularly from their kind of primary caretaker, in most cases, that's supposed to be a parent, that they also kind of experience this kind of stunted human development. And so, you know, a story like Jeannie complicates the idea of a female brain, right? Doesn't matter that she was born female. All of those things that, you know, people say exist in the female brain, you know, the empathy, the nurturing, none of that matters when you are not correctly socialized, when you aren't, in fact, still taught how to be a human. So just emphasizes that a lot of that isn't hardwired in. We have to learn it. But at the same time, and this is why the authors aren't just like pro-culturalism, they remind us it is only through our bodies that we encounter our social world. So, you know, our bodies, our genes, you know, the stuff that is encoded there, you know, that is important. And so what they want you to think about is that, you know, it's like a rectangle. Humans are like rectangles. You know, a rectangle, you take the length, you take the width, and you multiply. Human beings, you take our nature, you take our nurture, you take biology, you take cultural, social influences, and those things intersect in order to make us who we are. And so, you know, we see this in a lot of ways. You know, we see this in gene environment interactions, that some genes, the likelihood that they're going to be expressed have a lot to do with the environment people are raised in. One popular example of that comes out is, you know, the so-called sociopath gene, which is actually like a cluster of traits: impulsivity, lack of consciousness, not consciousness, conscience, lack of conscience, as well as aggression, right? You have the makings of a sociopath. But if you're born in a supportive household with parents who love you and support you and work on ways for you to help control your impulses and your anger issues, then those children did not grow up to express those characteristics versus children that grew up in violent or cold, unloving, non-supportive homes. Another good example of gene environment interactions are identical twins who are adopted and raised in separate homes. They start off with, yes, in terms of genotype, pretty much identical. So they should be the exact same regardless of how they're raised, but that's found to not be true. And actually, we call this twin studies. Twin studies are a very popular way for researchers to try to determine how much of something is nature versus how much of something is nurture. Because if identical twins raised in separate homes wind up behaving very similar when it comes to a characteristic, like, I don't know, introversion, then they might say, okay, that characteristic has a very strong genetic underpinning. But if they wind up acting very differently on that characteristic, and they were raised in different homes, then, it tells us that maybe environment matters more. We've already talked about the hormonal feedback loop, right? A way in which something that's biological, like your hormones, interact with the environment and the context, right? And they can make, in the case of testosterone, right, how you behave, the situations you find yourself in, if you're having to constantly call upon that fight or flight response, engaging in aggressive behavior, this can kind of change your hormonal makeup. And then this section also talks about just the role of society in general. Going back to those differences in strength, muscular arms, the extent to which males and females vary on muscularity, especially in the arms, has a lot to do with, what messages are they getting from their society? If you live in a society that makes it totally acceptable for women to do push-ups on their knees, beginning at, as young girls, if you can still get a presidential physical fitness badge without doing a pull-up, that was me, then it's like, why would you then be expected to have muscular arms or have this arm strength as an adult woman? But in societies where, there isn't not this societal acceptance around this distinction, not to say that women develop arms just as muscular as men's, but it's worth noting that the size of the distinction, the size of the difference is diminished. A good example of a country like that is Israel, where everyone is required to serve in the military. And so for that reason, they don't have this kind of dramatically different physical fitness expectations for their women. So they have a society where much more of their young women can do push-ups on the toes and do pull-ups. In our own society, if we look at marathon times, it used to be believed that women should not run marathons. It was thought to be bad for their fertility, their uterus. And so, men ran marathons. And so women didn't start running until much later. And that picture is a picture of the first woman that ran in the Boston Marathon. She actually, disguised herself. And then when it became clear she was a woman, you see, they tried to physically, pull her off the course, kick her out of the race. But what's interesting is, yes, men still run faster marathons than women, but that gap is closing so quickly, not just even among the fastest men and women, but even average male and female marathon times. And so, as you kind of look and see how, the gap is starting to close, you can maybe imagine that there might be a future where it more or less disappears. And then the final example that your book talks about in terms of role of society is like bone density, that something that we might think is biological still can be very mutable based on a given society. And so here they were talking about particularly about um, young Jewish boys. In this case, because they spend so much time studying, that they are not able, and this is Orthodox, ultra Orthodox Jewish adolescent boys, because they're expected to spend so much time on their books versus exercising. They spend so much more time indoors. Their bones never grow as strong as even their sisters. And so, this is something that, once again, that's the role of society, right? If you just looked at the difference, you might be like, oh, maybe it's biological, but really it's social. And then, of course, once again, going back to, your brain is what you do with it, in that Tetris example. And the other reason why they emphasize this kind of biocultural intersection is because of intersectionality and difference, right? The fact of the matter is gender is only one identity that intersects with our other social identities. And so this is important because, yes, there might be some biological differences between males and females, but those differences get filtered through life experiences that are shaped and influenced by our other identities. And so specifically, like that case of the bone density, a biological aspect of Orthodox Jewish boys, a specific culture, specific gender identity. And so, the quote from 6061, when men and women share other identities and life experiences, those things bring the sexes together, producing even physical similarities as our complex bodies respond to shared cultural environments. So, our gender identity is not our only important identity. And so, how we express certain things, how we experience certain things, also is also relevant to these other identities we have, like race, like religion, like class, like ability, education level. And then finally, your book looks at evolutionary theory basically just to poo-poo it. And that's because, evolutionary theory, every couple, keyword here is theory. A lot of this is not research supported because it doesn't exist. So, evolutionary theory often makes hypotheses, often makes arguments based on, what they know about the sexes now and why they think we evolved that way. So it's like working backwards. It definitely doesn't fit the research model at all. And it's no really way to, to test it because we've evolved the way that we've evolved. So they reject evolutionary theory, and they explain that, a couple of reasons why they reject it is a lot of evolutionary theory asserts that the nuclear family is natural, but there's a lot of anthropological, archaeological evidence that disproves this, that for a lot of human history, kin groups were the building blocks of society, not nuclear families. And this is important because, if there's no nuclear family, there's no head of the household. And so unsurprisingly, a lot of these early hunting gathering societies, based on evidence that we have, were relatively egalitarian. And although evolutionary theory focuses on the ways in which we supposedly evolved to be different, the authors posit that the opposite's probably true. We probably evolved to have more similarities than differences because it would have been maladaptive to have these kind of separate spheres based on sex in a society where you could possibly lose a lot of women and a lot of men, right? That, whether it's due to war, whether it's due to pregnancy, whether it's due to illness, it would have been maladaptive to human survival to have a lot of things that only males did versus only females, that instead males and females did a lot of the same things in these early societies. And so that's true even just considering something like child rearing. or sexuality, comparative to, later periods in society. There was much greater sexual tolerance of homosexuality, as well as extramarital sex, to the extent that marriage existed, in any form. And that's because, a lot of focus on marriage and a lot of focus on female sexuality has a lot to do with paternity, right? The idea that property needs to be left to legitimate children. But in these forager societies, tribal children belong to the entire tribe. And of course, a lot of these societies did not have private property. So it didn't really matter if somebody, the saying, mama's baby, daddy's maybe. It did not matter in these societies whether you were only daddy's maybe. In societies, later societies, as we started to focus more on private property and separate spheres, and men as being the head of the household, a lot of the kind of, especially for women, a lot of the kind of strict strict limits that were placed on female sexuality and regulations around female sexuality was because of concerns about, how will we know whose baby this is? Because of course, Maury did not exist to tell people whether or not they were the daddy back then. This wasn't a concern in these early theories. And so the kind of final point that they break down from the evolutionary theorists has to do with this plenty of seed to sow. You might have heard some people say like, oh, men weren't meant to be monogamous. That's why they have so much sperm, but women have limited eggs. And they just kind of point out that this just isn't supported by evidence. That, yes, men have a lot of sperm and women have limited eggs, but there has never been a society that's just had unlimited women for men to impregnate, just in terms of age and society size, and the fact that in most societies, some level of incestual relationships were largely frowned upon in a lot of societies. So they're just like, so that's another evolutionary argument that to the authors just falls flat. And so they kind of end with the point that while gender has mattered in pretty much all societies, how and why it's mattered in terms of how people organize their lives and tasks has varied. And once again, remember that, we do have this research gap because of weird. And so, the final kind of points I want to make, the book has this great quote: "There's always an easy solution to every human problem, neat, plausible, and wrong." And so when we revisit the question, are there real differences between men and women? The book just warns us to, be aware of deceptive differences, that these things that we think of as being real differences between males and females, ask yourself, do they meet those four definitions, or really just that fourth definition, biological and immutable? And if the answer is no, then regardless of what we might see, observe difference, that this is, in fact, a deceptive difference, probably based a lot more on society and learned differences than real differences between the sexes. And so the answer to that question, biology has us on a leash, but it's very, very long. The gender binary that characterizes men and women as opposite sexes isn't reflected in the science. And fails to do justice to what we know about human biology and history. Moreover, what differences we do find are also shaped by life experiences that are not centrally about gender. So for the most part, like I said, this whole chapter was just a very long explanation based on evidence, that we are not opposite sexes. We are a species that has low sexual dimorphism, and regardless of what the binary would encourage us to think, what society at different time periods has encouraged us to think, by emphasizing deceptive differences, male and female bodies are not that dramatically different.